Jesus, who predicts the coming of Muhammad, which is another intriguing element of his personality.
Ooh, Jesus predicting Muhammad. Okay.
What does it mean?
This is interesting.
But the Quran never explicitly says that Jesus was celibate, that he never was married or had children. It's not explicit in the Quran. Muslims, as a rule, we could speak about this if you want to, but
So Jesus was banging people. What the heck? Is that what he's implying? That Jesus in the Quran could have been freaking banging people, bruh. So why would he need to come back for? Why would he? He's already in the afterlife. Why? What's the point of him coming back down in the mortal realm again? What's he achieving? What?
I got my PhD in
Okay,
Christianity,
continuation of
late
members.
antiquity, but no one can really decide
Like I
when
said,
late antiquity begins and
if you're
when
an active viewer, it's
ends.
only
I
99
personally would
cents,
say it
bruh.
stretches from the year
Only
250
99
to around the
cents,
year
bruh. For your
650.
suggestions to
Some
be
would say
done
the end of antiquity is
so
around
much more quicker.
700
I'm
or 750.
bunch of other perks.
But even at that earlier date, 650, we are solidly after the rise of Islam. But my graduate training didn't require any expertise at all on early Islam. I often find myself treating early Islam as somehow outside my field of the late Roman Empire, even though Islam emerged in close parallel with the late Roman world, drawing on many of the same cultural, religious, and intellectual traditions. So today I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds, a scholar of Islam.
And like cultural exchange is a real thing, and due to the proximity of not only the proximity but the prestige of Rome, a lot of cultural exchange happened between the
Studies at the
two,
University of Notre
especially
Dame.
with
His research focuses
Islam
on the
and
Quran, the
taking
origins
a lot
of
of
Islam,
Roman
and Muslim-Christian
traditions,
relations.
kind of.
And what makes his work especially compelling is how he bridges the study of early Islam with biblical scholarship. In our interview, we specifically talk about how the Quran depicts Jesus, and how Muslim and Christian traditions both overlap and diverge in understanding him. If you want to learn more from Dr. Reynolds, you can check out his YouTube channel or his free online course, Sacred Texts and Dialogue, Exploring the Bible and the Quran. Links to both of them are in the comments below. And without further ado, here's Dr. Reynolds. So I study early Christianity, and obviously the main person in Christianity is Jesus. And so when we think about Jesus as a figure, as a religious figure, we think of Christianity. And if you're like the astute academic type, you're like, okay, we'll talk about Judaism as well because he was a Jew during the second temple period. But Jesus as a religious figure in Islam is also a thing, but that just doesn't seem to come up as often, at least in the field of early Christian studies. We just don't talk about early Islam and how Jesus figured into the Quran, and I would just be really curious to talk about Jesus as a figure in Islam.
absolutely, Jesus is not only a central figure in the Quran, he's also a contentious figure. The Quran, makes its own claims about Jesus in a sophisticated way. So it sort of engages with Christian ways of understanding Jesus, and possibly sort of reshapes or maybe thoughtfully redescribes principal or central elements of the Christian story about Jesus, famously the crucifixion. And the classic Islamic teaching is Jesus was not crucified at all. So not only did he not rise from the dead, he didn't even die. And so, I mean, it's difficult then, from an academic perspective, to sort of be attentive both to simply the central place Jesus has in the Quranic view and the Islamic view of God's relationship to humanity, but then also be attentive to sort of the contention around Jesus in the Quran.
So let's take it piecemeal then. So immediately I'm going to show how I do not know Arabic very well, because I did a whole video on this topic and I kind of astutely avoided saying the Quranic name of Jesus because I can't do the Ain. So walk us through, in Hebrew and Aramaic, his name was Yeshua or something along those lines.
Right.
In the Quran, it is not Yeshua.
His name is Isa, and the name is sort of a great place to start in a conversation about Jesus in the Quran, because it's a real mystery. Now, to those sort of habituated to English or other non-Semitic languages, the Semitic name, or the common Semitic name for Jesus, which is preserved in Arabic Christian tradition, which is Yeshua, it might sound like it's just a different version of what the Quran has, which is Isa. So we kind of hear like an S sound in there, in that Ain sounding, but in fact, they seem to be totally different names. So on the first version, sort of the typical Semitic version, that famous consonant, ayin.
So how can you get different names from that? Because when I reacted to the like Jesus's name, what was Jesus's real name? Go check that out after this reaction if you haven't. What I comprehended from that video was that Jesus' name wasn't really nothing special, number one, and it was simply just translated differently, which is makes sense, right? I mean, like freaking that's a very normal thing. Names are usually spelled differently to accommodate for the way how languages need to pronounce, words and whatnot. That's very normal. So how do you get a different name that sounds so similar? I actually had someone commented this, the fact that the names, it's mysterious where the Islam name for Jesus came from. I'm like, what? I'm like, but how could that just suddenly have a whole different name? Like, because you had the original, and we watch how it was slowly like translated and changed throughout the various languages and whatnot. So it's like, how could you just have a name? Not only that, but the name that is so-called mysterious sounds similar, very similar. Like it was simply just like an end result of a few modifications. That's the proper word to actually use for something like this: modifying. So I don't know. Maybe I don't think it's like mysterious at all, because I mean, I believe that there's something called too much of a coincidence, and I mean it's too much of a coincidence how the mysterious name for Jesus in Islam is coincidentally very sounds very similar to all the other modifications of Jesus's original name, really and truly. So
Is at the end. In the Quranic version, it's at the beginning.
Also, like I said before, in long videos, what I do is I just let it play out for a bit and then I give my opinion on that. So again, a lot of you like to like it a lot more, so I'm just gonna do that now. Overall, just let the video play for a bit, then say my opinion, rinse and repeat.
It's a real mystery. There's been a million different arguments about why the Quran uses a distinctive name for Jesus. I mean, ranging from maybe the Quran was employing some form of the name of Esau, the brother of Jacob, familiar from the book of Genesis, and it perhaps sort of responding to or absorbing Jewish anti-Christian language, to most recently, one of the great scholars of Arabian epigraphy, Ahmed Jalad of Ohio State, has argued that there is a precedent for the name Isa used by the Quran for Jesus and an inscription, a pre-Islamic Arabic language inscription. And so maybe there is an ancient, particularly Arabian way of referring to Jesus. I could say more about that. I don't want to get too much in the weeds right away. But in a way, I think the difference in the name, so in Arabic, Yeshua, in the Arabic Christian discourse, and Isa in the Quran and Islamic tradition, that difference is at least as useful as a sort of foundation for teaching about the distinctive portrait of Jesus in the Quran.
Yeah, so speaking of the distinctive portrait of Jesus in the Quran, let's talk about his biography. What biographical details come up in the Quranic narrative? Because, we're very familiar, at least in my field, with the gospel stories. You have Jesus's mother Mary. He has siblings. He has disciples. He does miracles. He travels around the Galilee region and then eventually ends up in Jerusalem, where he's crucified. You've already alluded to the notion that he was not crucified in Islamic tradition. So what does the biography of Jesus look like in the Quran?
There's not a lot about Jesus in the Quran, and that's really a key point and a point that's often missed. So if you kind of, I don't know, wander around the internet and different social media, you'll usually see chat around the doctrinal differences between Christians and Muslims about Jesus. So, maybe the crucifixion point, but, above all, the Christian claim that he is Son of God and Savior, Lord and Savior. So, and then the Muslim response that no, he wasn't Son of God. He didn't have a divine nature. He was a prophet like all of the other prophets. So that's what you usually run into, my kids on some social media, if they happen to have some religious content, they'll see something about this if it's a back and forth between Muslims and Christians. But a really sort of more fundamental point, which to me is illustrative also about the Quranic project around Jesus, is that there's very little about the life story of Jesus. So just to give maybe a few sort of indicators of what is actually there, there's a description of his nativity. So the Quran has 114 chapters. By tradition, it was proclaimed by a man named Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, in the cities of Mecca and Medina, so what is now Saudi Arabia, between the years 610 and 632 CE. And so we have two versions of the birth of Jesus in chapter 3 and chapter 19. So in Arabic, the first chapter is called Al Imran, and the second chapter is named after Mary, so it's called Maryam by most conventions. So we have that. And then we have allusions to different miracles. None of the miracles are really described. They're sort of cited as maybe evidentiary proofs of his prophethood. Some of these miracles are familiar from the four Gospels in the Christian New Testament, healing the blind, even raising the dead. And then other miracles are known from other early Christian sources, such as creating a bird from clay and bringing it to life with his breath. So we have these allusions to miracles. And then we have some statements of Jesus, none of which correspond to anything he says in the New Testament. And most of those statements are contentious or polemical. So Jesus is employed to reprimand Christians for what they say about him. And then there's some sort of mysterious stuff, which we could get into, about the end of Jesus' life and possibly his role in the end times. So, maybe the bigger thing to say is like, what's missing, which is, a Muslim might say, well, you don't have to put it that way. But, if you look at the content of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from the New Testament, there's almost nothing from those Gospels in the Quran. So, all of his travels in Galilee, Samaria, Bethany, Jericho, all of that, all of the long discourses, all of the contention around, the Sabbath or other elements of Jewish law, the bread of life, the multiplication miracle. It's just not there. So, on the one hand, he is a common figure between Quran and Bible. On the other hand, there's actually very, very little in common.
Okay. All right. So this is my take on this, right? This is my personal take. Yeah, I remembered, and this is a very common question that I always have towards Muslims, especially Muslims who comment on my comment sections. I always ask them, why do you think that the Jesus that died on the cross was fake? Why? And they always say, oh, we don't really have enough details on that. And I'm like, what? How can you say we basically just have theories on something as important as that? You can't just make up theories on something that is literally world bending and just expect people to just believe you. And that's the thing. The thing with the Christian Bible and Christianity is obviously saying Jesus came on earth, Jesus died for our sins. Here's the proof. Here's the proof right here. Okay? Like what he was saying. The Bible has all of this stuff about Jesus, when he was born, who his mother was, where he died, his whole entire biography, right? But the Quran has nothing. And that's where, you know, I fall short with Islam. I'm not going to just sit there and just believe something where you're basically saying we don't have enough concrete evidence, or, and not only that, to add on to that, saying no, the Quran has little details on Jesus. What? Little details on Jesus in the Quran, but he's supposed to be a major prophet. Even if Jesus wasn't the person who died for our sins, etc., etc., he's still considered a major prophet in Islam. Isn't he like the third most major prophet in Islam? If I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, just correct me. So, regardless, he's top 5. I know that for sure. He's top 5. Top 5 most important prophets in Islam. So how do you have such little information on him? Doesn't make any sense. But you have all this info about Prophet Muhammad. You see what I'm saying? And you expect people to just sit there. And guys, this is not me like attacking anybody or nothing. I'm just being objective. It's like, bro, when you make a claim, you need evidence. The Bible makes claims and the Bible has evidence. Plain and simple. The Romans documented Jesus. Jesus was a real person. He was a real person. That is a fact. That is a fact. You do not need to rely on the Bible or any other religious document to know that Jesus was a real person, because the Romans literally documented him too. So there's also that. But the difference, like I said, is that the Bible is saying everything that Jesus did is factual. Jesus, everything that we said about Jesus coming to die for our sins is factual. That is what the Bible is saying. And the Bible has more than enough that I don't even need to talk about here. Because all I'm pointing out is just that, you know, it's very hard for me to give credibility to the Quran about Jesus or how Muslims view Jesus. It's so hard for me to like give credibility to that and validate that. You see what I'm saying? Because one, you're saying that he didn't die on the cross. The person that died on the cross was fake. Where's your proof? When they asked for the proof, you said, or Muslims will say, well, we don't have enough. It's just like basically a theory. We don't have concrete proof, but most likely the person who died on the cross was a fake. Like, what? And then, right? Okay, because I was coming into this video under the assumption that the Quran would have much more details on Jesus. So I was thinking when I watched this video, when I started watching it, oh, okay, let's hear what the Quran really has to say about Jesus, how he became a prophet and whatnot, only to hear, oh, the Quran doesn't have much details on Jesus. So it's like, okay, that just, it's like, it adds insult to injury. Like, I can't really take that seriously now. No, don't get me wrong, we have 30 minutes left of this video, but I'm just saying, based on what I'm hearing thus so far, it's kind of like, it's kind of icky. Because I really expected to hear the Quran's perspective from start to finish about Jesus. I was really hoping to hear explanation for everything about what Muslims say about Jesus and why they do. And thus so far, again, we have 30 minutes, so let's see. Okay, let's continue.
There's so much to unpack there. I've always been aware of the story of him turning the clay birds into living birds, because this is an echo of the infancy gospel of Thomas, which is an early Christian text where Jesus does exactly that, which I find absolutely fascinating, that a apocryphal Christian text seems to be echoed in this Quranic story.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I remember, but you could correct me on this one, Andrew, that in the infancy gospel of Thomas, there's some question also of his possibly doing that on the Sabbath. That could be from another tradition, but also it's meant to point to somehow his creative power. I don't know much about sort of the theology or the Christology behind that text, but it clearly sort of, replicates the creation of Adam in the Genesis account, where God creates Adam from clay and brings him to life through his breath. And so Jesus sort of manifests his divine power by doing something similar, again with dirt or with clay. The Quran actually, it's the only time that it uses the verb that's used in reference to Jesus' miracle, khalaqa in Arabic. It's the only time it uses it other than its principal use of that verb, which is for God's creation. And then sort of the key detail and an interesting one also from the perspective of the history of Islam's emergence is that the Quran adds, after mentioning this miracle, that Jesus did so, that is, created life, by the permission of God. Now, for Muslims today, they'll often bring this up and they'll say, listen, everything Jesus did was done by God's permission. None of his miracles, therefore, redound to any divine nature. From a historical point of view, however, that the Quran adds this for Jesus's miracle, which it does not do, for example, for Moses's miracles that are mentioned in the Quran, shows that there presumably was a sort of sectarian context that the Quran is engaging with. In other words, the Quran is probably aware that Christians in its time and place were bringing up this story of the bird to argue for Jesus' divinity, and sort of anticipating that this kind of story could be used as a Christian argument. It seeks to undermine that in advance by saying, and he did this with the permission of God.
Right. So admitting, sure, he has miraculous powers, but this does not signal any divine status.
Absolutely. Yes. And I mean, that's sort of the heart of the matter for the Quranic. Jesus and the Quranic message about Jesus, it does not seek to really retell a new story about Jesus. It doesn't provide an alternative to the Christian Gospels. It means to make a point about Jesus and his nature as only a prophet, never refers to him as Son of God, and to advance a figure, Jesus, who predicts the coming of Muhammad, which is another intriguing element of his personality.
Ooh, Jesus
What
predicting Muhammad.
does
Okay,
it mean
this is interesting.
for Jesus to be a prophet, as opposed to Lord and Savior in Christianity? So I'm curious by the status.
Oh,
of
that's a good
prophethood.
question
So
there.
he can do miracles.
That's a good
he
question
can,
there.
Presage the coming of Muhammad, but it never reaches obviously the level of Christianity where he is God incarnate. So what does the status of prophet mean?
Terrific. Yeah, terrific question. There's sort of, I think, two ways of answering that. One way is intimately linked with the Quranic argument about Muhammad. So maybe I'll circle back to that. But another way is to sort of take a step back and just sort of look at the Quranic doctrine on prophets generally. So I don't want to turn this into a lecture, but I mean, in brief, for the Quran, prophethood is the principal sort of articulation or manifestation of divine mercy. So the Quran sort of agrees with the Bible. Of course, the Bible in some ways is a library in addition to being a book, but sort of agrees with a major emphasis of much of the Bible, which is that, God is a God who cares about the world. It's not the God of, say, Aristotle, who's just kind of floating around there doing nothing, and seeks, sort of observes humans sort of doing their own thing, getting into trouble, and intervenes. And the biblical story of God's intervention has its own particular sort of fabric, its own particular details. The Quranic version of God's intervention is prophethood. So God remains transcendent and attentive to the ways in which humans are acting badly, forgetting things, sinning, all this sort of thing, including, by the way, paganism and idolatry, which is a particular sort of theme that's brought up in the Quran. God sends prophets to remind them. And the prophet usually has two roles. One is to communicate the words given to him by God. Prophets are always men in the Quran, by the way. Communicate the words given to him by God. And then the second is to sort of exemplify proper behavior. So the prophet is a spokesman and an exemplar. I could circle back and speak a little bit about how the figure of Jesus as prophet is connected to Muhammad, but I don't want to go on too long if you want to follow up with that, or should I go on?
Okay, few things to note here. One, good on him for pointing out the fact that the Bible isn't a book; it's more like a library. That a lot of people don't really know that the Bible is a collection of testimonies. It's not just. This is why whenever people atheists make the argument of, oh, a nigga wrote the Bible, a human wrote the Bible, you could write anything. That's not the case. The Bible is literally just a mass collection of testimonies that was grouped together in one giant, essentially miniature library. So, really love the fact that he pointed that out. Also, now, Son of God. I had this discussion with my brother, who's supposed to be reacting with me on some of these religious stuff and whatnot. Son of God. Here's the thing. The Bible, I keep saying this because a lot of people need to understand that the Bible talks in parables. So it's best not to take the Bible's words literally. So what does Son of God mean? It's very simple, actually. Jesus is a piece of God. A piece of God that God literally took a piece of himself. He basically split his soul and he sent that soul to the mortal world. That's it. That's it. Okay? Guys, Jesus is, metaphorically speaking, the Son of God. Okay, we're not talking like literal, like God freaking impregnated a woman or... No! Although Mary had to be pregnant, yes, because that's just how it works from the mortal world. But like, God didn't freaking bang Mary. No, God took just took a piece of his soul, and that was Jesus. That's it. That is nothing complicated. I don't understand why people just. I said this in my comments before, and people, like a bunch of Muslims, just could not understand that logic. Like, I'll see Muslims being like, "Oh, God is so all powerful and could do any and everything," which is true. And I'm always like, okay, why do you guys say this, but you just can't fathom that God could just take a little piece of himself and just make a person out of it? He did the same thing with Adam and Eve. Are we not going to forget how woman came to be? Hello? That's literally how women, the Bible describes how women came to be. Adam was lonely, so what did God do? God took a piece of his rib, a piece of Adam, okay? He didn't just freaking make Eve from scratch. No, he took a piece of Adam, if I remember correctly, his ribs, and that's how he made Eve out of that when Adam was asleep. So if he could do that to a person in the mortal world on earth, who's to say he can't do that to himself? You see what I'm saying? That's why I'm like, bro, this is not complicated. This is not complicated at all.
Oh no, I think that would be important, because I guess I'm wondering, just like, what does Jesus accomplish for the Islamic tradition? Like, why? You know, if Jesus and Christianity, at least we could go deep into Christian theology, but like, what the point is, you know, save humanity, take on the sins of the world, you know, eventually redeem humanity and defeat Satan at the end of time. Like, there's kind of like a list of things that Jesus accomplishes in the Christian theological lens. And I'm just wondering, like, to say Jesus is a prophet and he's here, he comes to earth and he does some miracles. I'm just curious, like, what does he accomplish for Islam?
Terrific. So I think that too, there's two ways of answering it, because we can look just at sort of the Quran's interest in Jesus. But of course, Islamic doctrine, as with Christian doctrine, even though people might say, oh, it's scripture alone. In fact, it's not scripture alone. There are other elements that sort of enter into doctrine. So the way Muslim, sort of the theological masters of Islamic tradition would answer that question would actually be more robust in certain ways. So as for the Quran itself, Jesus comes in a line of prophets, but they all look suspiciously like Muhammad. It seems evident the Quran, like the key question, its key demand is that you accept both God and Muhammad. So, even this is reflected in the Islamic profession of faith or Shahada. There's two parts to it. It's God and Muhammad. Many mosques will have Arabic calligraphy somewhere that will have Allah and Muhammad. And they explain, well, Muhammad is not God for us, it's not divine, but the testimony of faith that Muslims must accept is both God and Muhammad, and that reflects what the Quran does with the prophets. So I go into detail, but Abraham in the Quran, Noah in the Quran, other figures who are not in the Bible, they all look suspiciously like Muhammad, and Jesus does as well. So Jesus is meant to sort of maybe give a proof that, Muhammad, he's like the earlier prophets. And perhaps that proof is targeted particularly at Jews and Christians, the way of saying, listen, guys, you accept Abraham, Noah, Moses, and Jesus, you should accept Muhammad. They're all basically the same. Now, just on the second way of addressing the question very briefly, many Muslim thinkers would say, well, Jesus does play a particular role, and they would sort of tell a story of salvation history, which to me is not actually evident in the Quran itself, but there are other traditions in Islam that Muslim thinkers draw on to sort of tell this story. And according to the story, the three prophets, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, begin to sort of represent Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which is a little bit paradoxical because a Muslim would say at the same time, they're all really Muslim prophets. Nevertheless, according to the story, and this story is told in part by the great novel, The Children of the Alley by the Egyptian Naguib Mahfouz in the 20th century. But according to this story, Moses sort of represents the justice, even the vengeance of God, and the strictness of the law which God imposes on humanity. And Jesus represents sort of the gentleness and the merciful side of God. And then Muhammad, of course, is like the perfect combination of both of those elements. So that is one way of answering that question. What does Jesus accomplish? Well, a Muslim thinker might say, he actually does show us a certain element of God, his mercy and compassion.
Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. Now, I'm looking at this with a Christian perspective. However, I'm gonna pause, turn that off for a second. I mean, it does make sense. That does make sense. But Jesus being on the same level as Moses, that sounds weird to me. I don't know. That sounds so weird to me because Moses was important. Don't get me wrong, but that's interesting. But it just sounds weird to me, honestly. It just sounds weird. Because I could say this, all humans and their personality traits are traits from God. I mean, that's a fact. I mean, we were literally made in the image of God. All of our emotions and feelings, that's all from God. Now, don't get me wrong, because I said this before, and some people were like, oh, well, jealousy, you have these negative emotions and whatnot. Guys, our emotions obviously, when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, obviously that's been, messed with. That's been fiddled with. That's been corrupted, quite literally. It's been poisoned, metaphorically. So, there is. I'm just pointing that out there. But our emotions are from God. Even anger. God gets angry too. Okay, God experiences negative emotions too. But the way how we experience it has been corrupted due to Adam and Eve eating the fruit, that which corrupted the whole world. Yes. That is true. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because why would God need to send someone to, I don't know, show his compassion? What? Also, wouldn't Moses be like the more like compassionate, like gentle one? Because, or wouldn't they be both equally like compassionate and gentle and whatnot? Because if I remember Moses correctly, he was tasked with freeing the Israelites and sending them to the promised land. That's how I remember Moses. I don't remember anything about Moses like being supposedly to represent a piece of God's personality. I have that's why I said this is weird to me. I don't know. If somebody want to elaborate on that further in the comments, you are free to do it.
In Islam, there's hadith. This wider collection of literature about Muhammad, and you mentioned there's not a ton of biographical detail about Jesus in the Quran. So I'm wondering, is there a penumbra, a larger body of literature about Jesus, if we can't call it hadith? I don't know what we would call it in early Christian studies. We might call it apocrypha or extra biblical texts. But I'd be curious to know what that looks like.
Yeah, really, really important point. And in fact, many of the assumptions that Muslims have today about Jesus are not explicitly mentioned in the Quran. And, just as you anticipate, they come from a separate body of literature. Hadith is, complicated term, maybe a little bit like Torah in a Jewish context, because it has different meanings. In its strictest sense, hadith are those traditions of things those traditions of things that Muhammad either said or did, which, since they are connected directly to Muhammad, who is the last prophet, have sort of legal value. They can establish norms for the community. But there's a broader sense of hadith, which is basically, any narrative. And so we do have these other narrations about Jesus that begin to appear in all sorts of different genres of Islamic literature, really beginning in the 9th century. So this is kind of the Abbasid period.
Okay.
And we continue to see new ones develop in the following centuries of the medieval period. There's a really great book called The Muslim Jesus. I think someone might correct me if I get the title wrong in the comments, by the Palestinian scholar Tarif Khalidi, in which he collects all of these Islamic Jesus narrations, and he calls those narrations, so not the material in Quran, but the other narrations, he calls them the Muslim gospel, which kind of complicates things, but it's also pretty useful because they actually have content. They actually tell a story or tell stories about Jesus. And, there are features in the Muslim gospel, to use Professor Khalidi's term, which are not found at all in the Quran. For example, the Quran never explicitly says that Jesus was celibate, that he never was married or had children. It's not explicit in the Quran. Muslims, as a rule, we could speak about this if you want to, but
So Jesus was banging people. What the heck? Is that what he's implying? That Jesus in the Quran could have been freaking banging people, bruh. Ah, hell nah. That is so cursed to think about. Oh nah,
they
bro.
don't consider the New Testament to be valid. But that feature of Jesus as a celibate, which is very unusual in Islam, and Muhammad said that marriage is half of religion. And so that feature is found in this Muslim gospel. Another element that's found in this Muslim gospel is sort of Jesus as ascetic. And I guess this kind of unfolds maybe naturally from the idea that Jesus was celibate. But I mean, he said that he fasted all the time. He had no house. He used a stone as a pillow, and many other traditions. And so this sort of new image of Jesus appears in the medieval period as a sort of proto-mystic, ascetic, and I sort of try to illustrate this with my students by showing them scenes of a movie about Jesus done in Iran around 2007. Nader Talibzadeh, I think, was the director of that movie. And, Jesus sort of kind of wandering through the wilderness is this long, sort of shaggy hair. And then he speaks very kind of mystically. And that, that vision of Jesus in that movie by Nader Talibzadeh, that's from the Muslim gospel more than from the Quran.
And so we're getting a little bit of biographical details here. So an ascetic wandering through the wilderness. You have already alluded to the traditions about his death or lack thereof in terms of the crucifixion. Like what does the end of the life of Jesus look like in the Islamic tradition?
Right. So in the 4th chapter of the Quran, which again has 114 chapters, more or less going from longer size to shorter size. So one of the longer surahs, chapter 4, which is named the chapter of the women in Arabic, An-Nisa, verse 157, it very sort of enigmatically has the Israelites boast of having killed Jesus. It even has them call him Christ, Al-Masih in Arabic, which is, again, a bit of an enigma. And then the Quran goes on to say, and now it's no longer the direct speech of the Israelites, but it's the narrator of the Quran, assumed to be the voice of God. Or rather, and then there's two ways of reading the passive Arabic verb shubbiha. Either the whole affair was made to seem to them, that is the Israelites, that way, or Jesus was made to appear to them. And for the most part, Muslim scholars go with the second alternative. So, you really get into niceties of Arabic grammar. And your decision on the grammatical question has like these massive consequences for the stories you tell. This is true not only about Jesus in the Quran, but almost everything. So most of Islamic tradition goes for the reading which would have Jesus made to appear to the Israelites. And even from a very early stage in the exegesis or the commentaries, we find these stories in which God took Jesus up to heaven before he died and then cast his likeness and presumably his voice, but that detail usually is not added, onto someone else. And in most of these stories, the Israelites, after this sort of dramatic transformation has taken place, that's when the Israelites kind of surround the house in which the apostles are staying. Very often, the detail is added to make the story work that there were 13 apostles, not 12, because Jesus goes to heaven, and then one of the 13 apostles is made to look like Jesus. So this means when the Israelites come to arrest Jesus, they find him with 12 apostles. So the math all works out. And, they take this man and they crucify him in place of Jesus. So many things could be said about it. I don't want to go on and bore you or your audience, but part of this story is sort of provoked by certain turns of phrase in the Quran, not only in that verse, but actually in a verse in Quran chapter 3, which I could explain. But it's often sort of said that this scenario would vindicate God's prophet. So, it's often said that, the Quran's view of prophets and God is the prophet never loses, the prophet always triumphs. The Christian story of a prophet, who suffers a humiliating death, just the Quran, it's not its style. And so necessarily it had to tell the end of Jesus' life in a different way.
I find that fascinating.
What? Wait. So just because that's not the Quran style, it had to sugarcoat it? What? That doesn't make any sense. No, like seriously. Guys, if it happened, it happened. Like you can't really just say, oh, the Quran isn't really like brutal or whatever, so we gotta like change it. What? That's literally how I interpreted that. Maybe I misinterpreted that or what? But what? Seriously, did I misinterpret that? That's not the Quran style, so it had to retell how Jesus died? What? The Romans documented his execution. How can you retell that? This is why I said, guys, you don't need these religious documents. The Romans literally documented everything that they did. What? That's literally distorting history. That's an intellectual insult. Bruh, no, you're not supposed to do that. I don't know. Maybe I misinterpreted this wrong. I don't know.
The perspective of early Christian studies, because you have this rich body of early Christian literature that casts Jesus as, this is the whole docetic perspective. Docetic being Jesus seemingly being there, but not really being there in the flesh. And depending on the text, sometimes he's more of an apparition. Sometimes he's kind of shape-shifting, or he appears human, but he's not really there. So the whole concept of Jesus being, taken away and then another person there appearing like him kind of falls in line with what some Christians would have said about Jesus too, maybe a few centuries later. The Quran is quite late in this for docetic Christian texts, which are much second or third century CE usually.
Right. I mean, I think that's sort of the key question. Earlier generations of scholars of the Quran often would call on, this sort of Gnostic, docetic movement in the early church, kind of comb through the heresiographies and then make the argument that, maybe a few of these guys were left in Arabia sort of unseen and somehow influenced Muhammad. But it's really hard to sort of, paint a picture that fills in the gap of a few centuries and makes a convincing or at least a compelling case for that. I mean, it should be said that the Quran does, even if we set aside the idea that the Quran couldn't countenance a prophet who seems to lose, even we set that aside because, I think that could be questioned in different ways. The Quran does sort of accomplish two things with this very ambiguous verse in Quran chapter 4, verse 157. On the one hand, it does seem to undermine Christian language around the cross and salvation. And, it's up in the air. I'm debated. I have a very strong view on that debate. There's a debate over how many Christians were around in the place where Muhammad was preaching. But let's say they were around, then the prophet and the early community would have been aware of Christian veneration of the cross, Christian language about the cross, even in presumably, Christian hymns, other sorts of homilies in sermons that were being preached. So that's one thing it does. And then something else it does, and possibly this is even more important to the Quran, which is it also emphasizes strongly rhetoric around the Israelites as prophet killers. There's a lot that could be said here, but a number of places it speaks, including just a few verses previous to this verse 157. I think it's in verse 155, but someone could correct me. It speaks of the Israelites as the killers of prophets, or those who kill the prophets.
What the?
And so,
no, don't get me wrong. Wait, what does he mean by Israelites? Because the Jews were the reasons why Jesus got crucified. I was actually talking about this with my brother the other day, actually. We were discussing, the Jews, they didn't believe in Jesus. Yeah, bruh, when Jesus came out. I mean, everyone should know that story. They literally were the reasons why. Oh, shit, bro. Jesus' own people literally was the reason why. Although he knew that was going to happen. Don't get me wrong. God, everybody, knew that was going to happen. When I say everybody, I mean Jesus and God. But still, I'm saying this because is that what he's referring to? Is that what he's referring to? Or is he referring to something else?
That sort of, heightens the tension around the crucifixion, because the Israelites are then, in verse 157, made to boast about also killing Jesus, and so
Okay.
they're sort of accused or maybe convicted of the crime in as much as they intended it.
Okay. That answers my
But
question.
the Quran
Okay.
still has God sort of outwitting them in the end. So this, they didn't actually get the great prophets Jesus.
Yeah, he successfully got away, as it were.
Exactly. Yes. So the Quran, it uses language of, and not only in the context of Jesus, but regularly that, basically God has the back of the believers. It uses this nice Arabic expression that Allah or God is wali al-mu'mineen, so the ally of the believers. This is very, very strong in the Quran. It's sort of, peppered throughout the entire text, this presentation of God sort of having the back of Muhammad's community. And the stories of earlier prophets sort of illustrate ways in which God had their back. And so it's a sort of reassurance that, now this community too, God is with you, Allah is with you. He will defend you and support you and even outwit, even in some verses, trick the enemies of the believers. I think there's very strong biblical sort of undercurrents to this. One might think immediately of the story of Exodus, for example, but that's a whole nother.
So you alluded earlier to Jesus may or may not playing a role in the end times, the eschatology of Islam. So in early Christianity, so in texts like the Book of Revelation, Jesus returns, as a conquering warrior figure who battles against Satan and Satan's armies. So is there any eschatological role for Jesus in Islamic theology?
Yeah, in the Quran, it's very ambiguous. There seem to be hints. Some people would find hints. Others would say, no, it's that you're reading this the wrong way. But no, there is a verse in the Quran just after the crucifixion verse, so verse 159 of chapter 4, which begins, again, the grammar's pretty tough here, but it seems to say all of the people of the book will believe in him before either their death or his death. And the way Arabic works, it's just ambiguous. One way of reading that is it's indicating what will happen when Jesus returns, which is that, Jesus did not die the first time around because he was taken up to heaven, body and soul. So it's the verses to be read before his death. And then he'll come back in the end times and basically unify the world around Islam. And everyone will believe in Jesus as a Muslim prophet. And then there's another verse in Quran 43, Az-Zukhruf, which speaks of it or him being a sign of the hour. We just have the pronoun there, but if you look at the context, it could be read as Jesus being a sign for the hour, and the hour with a capital H is understood to mean, the end times, the last time. And so commentaries on that verse say, well, Jesus is a sign for the hour because he will come down from heaven. And once you sort of see him, by the way, it's usually said he'll come down to Damascus, intriguingly enough. Once you see him, and then he'll head for the Holy Land. But once you see him coming down from heaven
Damascus
in Damascus,
is in a bit of a mess right now.
that kind of the hour.
Sorry, I had to say that.
So much, Andrew, that could be said about this because, eschatology is prominent in the Quran, plus, in chatter, scholarly chatter, among contemporary scholars, there's a lot of debate over possibly eschatological or apocalyptic elements in the early Islamic community, as there is in Christian studies as well. So, it's a really major question, the place of Jesus. It's sort of a problem in Islamic theology because it's really important that Muhammad be the last prophet.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like, this kind of gives Jesus a second chance, as it were, a second whack at it to be prophet.
Muhammad died. He died in 632. He's buried in a tomb in the city of Medina, but Jesus didn't die yet. He's alive right now, body and soul in heaven, and he will finish his life. And actually, a lot of narrations speak of Jesus when he comes back. Then he will get married and live as most Muslims do, live out his life, and then die and be buried in a tomb next
What?
to Muhammad in Medina.
What? Okay. Nah, you lost me there. I cannot lie. You lost me there. Why would Jesus need to come back? Why? Why would he need to come back for? For what? One, if I look at this, okay, let's look at this from the Christian perspective and then look at this from the Islamic perspective on why that doesn't make any sense. Jesus died on the cross for our sins. Why did he die on the cross? Because the world was sinful. If he didn't die on the cross, none of us would have the ability to have the choice to either choose the path to go back to heaven or choose the path that will lead you to hell. That is the purpose. That is why him dying on the cross matters. It was a sacrifice. He took all the pain of our wrongdoings. He took it. He sacrificed himself to do that so that we could witness A, the glory of God, B, the fact that he sacrificed himself, and C, after we witness that, we would be able to learn from our mistakes and choose the right path that will take us to heaven. Very simple, makes sense, nothing overcomplicated there, okay? That is the point of why he died on the cross, okay? If you look at that from the Christian perspective, okay? Why would he need to come back for? He already did what he had to do. Now it's up to us. It's up to us now. It's up to us. After Jesus, that was it. That was it. And that's the thing, is really and truly, after Jesus died, there was no need for another prophet. That's why the whole Prophet Muhammad thing is also like a question mark, because after Jesus died, that was supposed to be that. That was supposed to be the last thing. Like, yo, after that, everybody's like on their own now. Like, you've seen enough. You've seen enough from God. Like, this is more than enough for you to go down the right path. If you don't, that's on you, literally. Okay, number one. So let's look at this from the Islam perspective. After Muhammad died, and I have Muslims tell me this, that was that. No more prophets, none of that. None of that. Same thing like I was saying with Jesus dying. After that, that was that. Now it's up to you, bruh. So Muslims told me that after Muhammad died, that was that. That was supposed to be that. So why would he need to come back for? Why would he? He's already in the afterlife. Why? What's the point of him coming back down in the mortal realm again? What's he achieving? What? What's the point of him living out the life of a regular person, essentially, in this realm, in this mortal realm? The reason why we're living the lives that we are is literally just a test. That is it. We are literally just here as a test to basically see how genuine we are, to see our true colors, so that when God comes back on Judgment Day, we have absolutely zero excuses. Zero excuses. Why are we here for that? Because of what the devil did, what Lucifer did, because of the freaking rebellion that Lucifer did in heaven, that caused 1/3 of heaven to betray God. God doesn't want that happen again. That is why we are here on earth. That is literally just, it's basically just one giant social experiment to see who we are. That's it. That's that. So why would Jesus need to live a life here on earth for? Why? We already know the type of person that Jesus is. He himself said it. Jesus is gentle. Jesus is kind. God, according to the Islamic perspective, of what he said, I'm just quoting his words, Jesus showed the gentleness, the kind nature of God's side. You know, all the good stuff about God's side. So why would Jesus need to walk this earth again for? That doesn't make any sense. There's absolutely no reason for Jesus to come back here and walk this earth. There's literally none. Like, from both perspectives, there's absolutely none. From both the Christian perspective and both the Islam perspective. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. Because again, all this earth is just a test. Why is Jesus needed to be put in a freaking testing field? Guys, That is like training a soldier, right? That is like training a soldier, a veteran, a literal veteran who's been through war, and then looking at said veteran and being like, all right, we gotta send you back to where you trained before. Why? Why? Do you see what I mean? Like, why would he need to go back to where he trained before? The nigga has been through war. He's a veteran. He's experienced. Why would he need to do that? That's why this doesn't make any sense. Now, sorry that I have to raise my voice, but again, I just have to point this out because this is very important. A lot of people are going to listen to this. Okay, a lot of people are going to make choices based on this. So I'm just being objective as possible. But, I have to give constructive criticism where I see fit. Now, if I missed anything, again, you are free to comment in the comments below. Again, that's why I tell people, yo, if I miss something or if I'm lacking information on a certain thing, comment it in the comments below. But that's just how I'm looking at it from my view based on the information that I know. Okay, let's continue.
That's so interesting. Like, and him coming back as a prophet to unify people, it's still not as apocalyptic as Christian eschatology, where like the end of the world. Well, maybe not. But
It's
Him coming back as a prophet to unify people. That was the whole point of him dying on the cross, really and truly. You see, that was literally, like, from the Christian perspective, him dying on the cross was supposed to do exactly that. So, okay. Now, there is a second coming. I'm aware of that. But the second coming is just supposed to be God just grabbing his people and leaving, bruh. That's it. That's from the Christian perspective anyways. Him coming back as a prophet just to unify people. What? I thought that's what Prophet Muhammad was supposed to do, number one. And all the other prophets in Islam, if I look at this from the Muslim perspective, why would they need to do that? Again, this does not make any sense.
To complete the story, because I left stuff out. It's pretty violent.
Like, seriously, like, I'm trying to make sense of this, and I physically cannot.
As well.
Okay.
So he comes back, as you had mentioned in the book of Revelation, with this, exacting vengeance for the blood of the martyrs and other things like that the author's worried about. So yeah, Jesus comes back, and there is an antichrist figure named Ad-Dajjal, who's not mentioned in the Quran. He's coming from other traditions, and Jesus will confront him. There'll be big battles, different people will be slaughtered, crosses will be broken, pigs will be killed. So there's that kind of stuff too.
Right. So still end time battle sort of theme.
What's missing is, Jesus is not a king of the universe who will be enthroned in some way, or there's no heavenly Jerusalem coming down. So, in fact, there's another sort of messianic figure who comes in the end times called the Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I in most English spellings. And Jesus will sort of do his thing, defeat the Antichrist, and then, according to most narrations, pass over the rule to this other figure who's named the Mahdi, who will rule over the world. So not Jesus, but this other figure named the Mahdi will rule over the world in its sort of final period, maybe, I don't know, analogous. I don't know if there's any real connection, analogous to the ideas of millenarianism where Jesus rules for 1,000 years and that kind of things.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, with the Dune movies being such a big hit, the Mahdi is has become common parlance, and I've always found it. Yeah, you definitely should. You definitely should. I mean, the next one's coming out next year, I think, and it's called Dune Messiah, so it's even more apocalyptic, as it were. But I've always found that interesting, to having like two figures at the end of time, where you have Jesus, then him, passing the football, as it were, to the Mahdi. Like that is interesting.
Yeah, so 100%. Mahdi, it's a name that means the one basically who's rightly guided. There are some traditions which say, they're minority traditions, that Jesus is the Mahdi, but they're minority traditions. This has a whole nother sort of articulation in Shiite tradition, which, may or may not be interesting. because it's actually connected with a story of, the righteous leaders in Shiism known as imams. The last one disappears in the late 9th century, I believe. And, so this Mahdi figure is then understood to be the reappearance of this last Shiite imam. And then there's Sunni Shiite stuff that comes up there as well.
So I'd be curious about, I don't know how much you study contemporary Islam, but how is Jesus conceptualized today, or how does he factor into your average Muslim's life? Like, here in the 21st century, like, is he a kind of a minor figure that just kind of comes up in quirky theological questions, debates, or whatever, or is there a bigger role being played here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, terrific question. And I could sort of make some comments about that, from as a non-Muslim, as an outside from an outside perspective. But in some ways, I think it's a question that's best answered by a Muslim believer because as the way theology and spirituality is central to Christianity is very similar in Islam, and so one Muslim, drawing on their own spiritual or theological resources, may understand Jesus in one way, another Muslim in a second way, etc. But I mean, there are some important observations that can be made. Actually really interesting to me. It's not really my thing. So I study early Islam principally, but I'm very interested, and I read a lot and also watch Muslim preachers a lot on YouTube. So, when Jesus comes up both in literature, in modern Islamic literature, I know mostly the Arabic Islamic literature, but then also in sort of sermons and preaching or TikTok, it's usually in an apologetic context. So, I mean, that's how you usually run across the Muslim Jesus in the contemporary period. So, and there's all sorts of reasons about this. I mean, we shouldn't forget that there was a massive wave of Christian missionaries in the Islamic world, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, and that provoked, very dynamic response from Muslim apologists. But that hasn't slowed down at all in the 21st century. So Jesus is often seen, by Muslim apologists as sort of a good first step to do dawah, as it's called, basically Muslim evangelism, speak about why, for example, according to them, the Muslim view of Jesus is more reasonable, or, we love Jesus too. So you see people with t-shirts, I love Jesus because I'm Muslim, that kind of thing. And there is a little bit, in my humble opinion, of sort of separation between the rhetoric that's used by apologists, dawah folks, around Jesus, and the actual place that Jesus has in the norms for Islamic teaching and practice. Because in the end, Islamic teaching is that it's Muhammad's articulation of the Sharia is the only one that matters. Muslims, and the great Turkish scholar Mustafa Ekyol has pointed this out in his writings, Muslims actually do not turn to Jesus. They certainly don't turn to the Gospels, which they generally see as corrupt, to think about, how they should do their religion or how they should think about God. They turn to Muhammad and maybe Muhammad's companions. So there's that tension there. And I'll just add one further thing is that, the figure of Jesus also becomes, for certain Muslims, sort of an object of fascination to express other teachings. And I alluded earlier to the novel Children of the Alley by Naguib Mahfouz. It's not the only one. There are others I could speak about that are interesting in this regard, but it's a nice example because it's an allegory set in Cairo. In the chapter dedicated to Jesus, Naguib Mahfouz was a believing Muslim, even though he's accused of heresy and actually attacked towards the end of his life. But he tells the story of this figure is named Rifa in the novel, who clearly represents Jesus, but he becomes fascinated, Muslim his whole life, never converted to Christianity, and becomes fascinated with Jesus as a way of sort of articulating a new dimension of Islam that might be missed otherwise, which is, solidarity with the poor, solidarity with the outcasts, standing up to the abuse of power. So outside of apologetics, I mean, I think it's important to add, it's not only apologetics. There are very, creative, intriguing ways in which Muslims engage with Jesus.
Well, Dr. Reynolds, thank you so much for joining us. This was an absolutely fascinating discussion.
It was an honor and a pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
I mean, it was a good video. It was a good video. I heard out their perspective. I gave my opinions on it. So if you're new to my channel, you let my reaction, subscribe. If you have any videos like this that you would love to hear my reaction to, love to see my reaction to, suggest it. Ugh, I hate my overbite problem. But suggest it in the comments below. Eventually, I'll do it. Again, this was suggested by a member. It's only 99 cents a week. If you're an active viewer of mine, man, and you have a bunch of suggestions that you want me to do, because I have people asking me, when are you going to do this? When are you going to do that? Guys, if you are a member, your suggestions, you don't have to worry about none of that. And it's literally only 99 cents, dude. You can ask any of my members. I have 8 members. Thank you to all 8 people who joined. Okay, and none of them are disappointed. Okay? So, check it out. I'm going to put the link in the description, not description, but comments, where I show all the perks that you get for being a channel member. Not only that, but as I get more members, I will expand channel privileges and perks for channel members. All right, man? Turn the bell notifications on. Make sure to like the video so that other people like ourselves can see this and join this community, man. All right? Check out my other reactions like this. I have so much religious reactions at this point, bro. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.